We have to really understand the relationship of film, which is, originally still photography, then became moving photography, moving images. We kind of have to look at the relationship of this particular kind of technology, which then became an art, because we could apply our intelligence to it and shape it into all sorts of things that come out of that sort of primordial photographic relationship. We need to really look into what is that? What is a photograph? What is its relationship to reality? What is the moving image's relationship to reality? The heart of this, if we're talking about reaching our contemplative end, we're talking about, purifying our vision. And obviously we know that our vision, our way of seeing, will be purified in order to be in heaven. It's interesting to think about how media, particularly film, can sort of train us in a way to purify our vision now. One of my favorite things that Father Pine mentioned in his video was the relationship of advertising culture to modern entertainment industry. Advertising culture, without getting too deep into it, it has a flattening kind of effect. Advertising is not about reality. It's about fantasy. When that influences kind of an art form, which we might, we're saying has some kind of intrinsic, God-given relationship with reality. When advertising starts to come in and starts to make that more about fantasy than reality, we can start to say that we can see the influence of corruption at a very deep level. Now, this is all very abstract. What does that look like in terms of concrete? It really, what it looks like is kind of the glossiness is one way I would put it. There's a kind of glossiness. There's a slickness. There's a professionalism. There's an incredible, it's a very satisfying, and I'm struggling to sort of like find the words because it's something that we all interact with on a daily basis. Every film produced by Hollywood, has this. Every commercial you've ever seen has this. But it's a particularly slick, glossy way of presenting the world, of presenting things, of presenting people, which we know we enjoy seeing that. It satisfies it. There's a certain relation of beauty going on there, but it's not quite real. At the same time, though, to flip it to the other side and to sort of just do like home movies or something, to like sort of do the totally amateur. There's very little art or no art at all. And it's just this kind of like strict, pure realism, of like a home video or something, that's not satisfying either. Like there's a part of us that unless you're the person who made that video, but for an audience, that's not satisfying because there's a part of us that wants the true, really wants beauty. It wants the beauty and the form that, is graspable through a great film, or that we at least, receive in experiencing a great film, experiencing how it all works together. So all of this is a way of like, I'm bringing up all this stuff kind of just to focus in on the question of, particularly from the maker's perspective, how do we make something that aids the contemplative end? I would say that we need to respect this relationship with reality. At the same time, there needs to be some kind of respect, obviously, for the role of beauty. It can't just be unformed. So, and the question of finding that balance, is kind of the quest that we're on. It's looking into the reality of things. And just I'll throw this over to you in a sec, but just as a departing note about this idea, often it's easy to fall into thinking that there are certain genres, or there are certain, and by genre, I mean like, especially in narrative cinema, like, there's science fiction versus drama versus comedy and so on and so forth, different genres of narrative film, but then there's also genres of kind of like film at a wider level, like documentary versus fiction, narrative versus experimental or avant-garde. No genre has the corner on this having the best relationship with reality, or with form, with beauty. They all have examples of films that excel. And so the question is kind of what can we learn from this wide swath of cinema that's available to us in order to draw the principles out and to cultivate, an actual culture of making that is geared towards purifying our vision.
Right. Obviously, a question that is far too big for this episode, and that's sort of what we're doing over on Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, at more leisure. I actually want to keep with you and film for a little bit, because we'll have plenty of chances to talk about music later. I wanted to ask you, because Father Pine says that he's concerned about things playing to our senses and playing to our body. You mentioned in terms of the vision of reality, this glossiness, but in terms of specifically overstimulating the body in a way that's harmful to contemplation, what is it about the current sort of pop culture form of filmmaking that plays to the body in a negative way? Obviously, all art plays to the body because we experience everything through our senses, but in a negative way.
Yeah. So first, what I've already mentioned, just about especially particularly from a visual point of view, the corruption kind of our vision of reality through an overly commercialized, overly advertising influenced look. And one thing I forgot to mention about that earlier is just that I brought that up partly because I think a lot of Catholics think that that's what we should be doing just with Catholic content, where it's
Right.
like, if we make
true.
it slick and glossy and it's professional, it looks, and I'm not denying there's a pleasing quality. There's real beauty there. Let's be very clear. There's real beauty there. But I think a lot of Catholics think that if we just do it at the level of Hollywood, but about a saint or about a, Catholic figure or whatever, everything will be fine and we'll solve this problem. And I don't buy that. Because
putting aside whether those Hollywood films are good or not, of the sort that you mentioned, every story has to find its own proper form. So It's not necessarily a case of imitating another form and putting different content into it.
Yeah, now that's more from a critique about the visual kind of side of things, but I also want to focus that in on the rhythmic side. Most films are edited. They're made up of multiple shots, and so that brings in the whole question of editing a rhythm that is natural to each film. One example I would sort of bring up is again in the Hollywood influenced world of rhythm, TV shows, movies, particularly narrative ones, but you see this with documentary as well. The way in which they are edited is very much, it's not trusting people to keep up. It's not trusting an audience to be able to kind of sit with a film, sit with a shot that might be lasting longer than 5 seconds and just kind of absorb it. There is kind of a training of an audience to have their hands held, to kind of have the film do all the work for you. When part of the pleasure of watching a film is the aspect of discovery. It's realizing that you can kind of roam around in a film, or that the film can you can meet the film part way. The film can meet you part way. And it's not simply about one doing all the work. When you end up in a situation where one side, viewer or film, is doing all the work, that's when you end up in boredom. And you see this with Hollywood films where they have no trust in an audience and they're just kind of laying out every single detail in a way that treats you like a 2-year-old. And you see this also with very austere art films where, they're kind of holding back too much, and they're just kind of assuming that, the totally oblique thing that they're doing is going to be, that you'll latch onto it. And it's interesting that the sweet spot is this meeting of spectator and film in the middle into this collaborative kind of experience. Now, what does this have to do with rhythm? With regards to editing, a lot of modern media, is edited with the assumption that you're going to lose interest if it's not cutting at a certain rate. And so I would just, in the narrative context, like in certain television shows where, particularly reality shows, but you see this in like primetime, network dramas as well. You have a scene of, some dialogue happening, 2 or 3 characters, and each one has their own shot. It's constantly cutting from one perspective to another in the same scene, in the same space, so that we are being forced as viewers to constantly sort of start over in terms of our perception. Like we're constantly being reoriented around a space. And the more that you cut at a faster rate, and you see this if you compare, films and TV made today versus 30 or 40 years ago versus classic Hollywood, you can totally see the pacing is totally different. The rhythm of scenes, even if it's the same kind of dramatic or comedic scene, the pacing is very different by and large. And so I think what personally I find modern entertainment, in terms of its rhythm and how it cuts from one shot to another, I find it abrasive. I think to me, it absolutely disrupts contemplation. And part of the reason for that is that I've become, as a cinephile, I've become more accustomed to watching films from all sorts of time periods and other cultures, so that the idea of there being, there isn't any kind of one ideal rhythm that we all have to aim for. Mm-hmm. It's that you encounter lots and lots of different films that find the particular rhythm appropriate to what they're trying to do. And once a film finds that, then it's found its purpose. It's found its perfection in a way, at least one part of it. When you get attuned to that, and then you start to experience art that hasn't locked into that appropriate kind of rhythm, it becomes extremely abrasive. And to me, it's analogous to trying to pray, and you're being called, and you're being distracted at every, you're being called out of the room every 5 seconds. Mm-hmm. That's what it's like for me to watch like a reality show or something, where you're not getting caught up in a flow. You're constantly restarting your perception and your orientation of things. The more that a filmmaker kind of takes that for granted, and they, just kind of jump around the scene, I think that is actually an impediment to true contemplation. It's kind of assuming a way of looking at reality that isn't actually human. It's something that's very, mechanical and afforded by the ability of the camera. And so I would say that, and I mean, a totally different kind of field, but visual effects, you see kind of a similar kind of thing, where the more you rely on particularly digital effects, the more that a scene is kind of like animated as opposed to actually like made for real. All you have is the illusion of reality. The more there's a kind of like dehumanization, we're relying more on technology to kind of do something that is more removed from reality. And I think it has like a corrupting effect in some ways, maybe not a huge one, but it trains us to not really prize, what is real. And I think it also has the effect of, when you go back out into the world after seeing a film, a great film that truly brings you into contact with reality. And I'm not talking about just like, I say reality a lot. I'm not talking about kind of like this purist documentary kind of like reality look at nature or something like that. I mean, just reality and all its complexities, whether that's coming through a narrative form or documentary or whatever. But it doesn't matter the genre. If you see a great film that puts you in contact with what is truly real, you will be changed. You will come out into the world. You will see the world differently. You will be more awake. The senses will be more awake, attuned to life, to the world. And so I think that is literally, that's where, in these conversations, that's where we should be directing our energies, is to begin looking at this question of purifying the vision of what is false at a formal level, like with regards to the glossiness and the corporate commercialized culture, and also looking for what is appropriate, especially with regards to rhythm, so that we can really start to dig into what is truly real. It's just making me think about, like, in cinema, there's a certain mindset that is easy to fall into, where when you sort of break out of the mainstream offerings and you start looking at like the art house world or the foreign films, or just like films outside of the Hollywood mainstream, and because their rhythms, there's a lot of different rhythms to encounter out there, including very slow rhythms. chances are if you spend a lot of time at a film festival, that prizes the art of cinema, you might end up watching a lot of films that have very slow rhythms to them. And it's very easy to, because it's new and exciting in a certain sense, because it's new, it's a novelty. It's easy to kind of just assume like, oh, that's objectively higher. But if you spend enough time in that world and you watch a lot of mediocre, slow films, then you start to realize like, no, it's the principle is not that slow is better, and that slow is not necessarily more conducive to contemplation. Sometimes it is, but really it's not the slowness itself. Because you can make a film that is slow and truly boring and truly empty. And believe me, I've seen many of them, and some of them win awards, and this isn't about doing a whole reactionary thing on that, but it's just interesting. It just goes to show, like, if we're searching for the roots, the essence of these things, where it seems that we keep coming back to, this desire for richness, this search for richness, and that this acknowledgement that richness, is possible to find across a wide variety of categories and genres. And I think half the problem that we run into in our discourse on this, especially within the church, is getting hung up on categories and getting hung up on genres as the kind of like determinative factors for something's value.